So a customer hit me up saying they had this old Darth Revan lightsaber to be installed, and as it turns out, there's a part of this build that made it a bit more interesting than usual. So first, I want to show you the chassis I designed for this. This chassis is made to hold an 18650 lithium-ion battery, 28mm bass speaker, and a CFX soundboard. And at the top, we have a rotary chassis PCB I had to make fit. I'll explain why once we get to that part of the build. But here's the holder I designed for the other rotary chassis PCB that it'll be connecting to. And then I designed this holder for the NeoPixel connector. And while I was working on the designs for these parts of the chassis, I actually came up with another part I'm going to need, which I call the speaker booster. I'll show you what I use that for later on. But now I have all the parts I just showed you 3D printed and ready to go. So let me show you what other parts I'm using. First up is the NeoPixel connector, stock V3 like usual. Then we have the button solution for this hilt. This is what makes this build a unique challenge. And here's the rotary chassis PCB, along with some set screws that came with the button holder module. For the soundboard, I'm using CFX, and then I'm adding this Bluetooth module for an extra feature. For power, I'm using an 18650 lithium-ion battery, along with standard battery tabs, and finally we come to the end of the parts list with this 28mm bass speaker. So now that I've finally gone over all the parts and prep work, we can get started on the lightsaber build. Alright, so this is the part of the lightsaber that makes this build particularly tricky. This is supposed to go inside of the lightsaber to hold the buttons and the NeoPixel connector. By itself, it doesn't really seem like an issue, but once you put it inside the hilt, that's when you can start to see some problems. To actually put it in the hilt, we have to unscrew the emitter or the pommel section. Here I'm going to be unscrewing the emitter and sliding it in through the top. You'll see here that I have to line up the external button holes with the button channels on the module. This is so that when the actual buttons are in place, the module is able to slide in and out of the hilt. Now let me show you what happens when I put the buttons where they're supposed to be in the hilt. These things are really annoying to put in place. You have to balance each of them on the tip of your finger in order to guide it where they're supposed to be. And then each of the buttons has to be aligned perfectly in order to slide the module in place, which can end up being pretty difficult and take up a lot of time. Now imagine this module is attached to the main chassis. So every time you want to take out the chassis to access the soundboard or the battery, the buttons end up falling out and you have to do the whole process over again. So this is the solution I came up with for the button module problem. Instead of attaching this directly to the chassis itself, I'm going to make this its own separate module permanently attached inside the hilt. So not only did I make the NeoPixel holder, I also made the rotary chassis PCB holder for the back. This is what's going to allow me to have the buttons and the NeoPixel inside the hilt while being able to remove the chassis. Now we'll never have to deal with the buttons falling out when you want to access the soundboard or the battery. With all that out of the way, let's move on to setting up the NeoPixel connector. Since the wires from this have to run through the rotary chassis PCB, we're not able to have a second data line or a blade detection wire. So this is one of the few times I get to keep the wire usage to a bare minimum. The last thing I gotta do is sand down some of the extra material so that it fits inside of the holder. And now that I know it fits, I'm going to use some E6000 to secure it in place. Next, I have to put this whole thing into the metal holder. And to do that, first we have to put the wires through the middle hole before we can put the NeoPixel holder in. What's nice about this is you don't actually have to use glue to hold the NeoPixel holder in place. Instead, you're supposed to use the 3 set screws that come with the kit. And now, the NeoPixel part of this module is complete. The next parts of this would be the buttons and the rotary chassis PCB. Okay, let's go over how I went about setting up these buttons. First, I had to cut the legs of each button to be shorter. As you can see on this one, they're just way too long and don't actually fit into the holder like this. So I just take some wire cutters and snip them off. With that done, it's time to solder on the wires. Now I'm going to add some heat shrink to each joint. This will also protect the joints from touching the metal of the holder itself. You'll notice here that I actually used the soldering iron to shrink the heat shrink. That's because I don't have anything else to shrink it with. But with that, one button is done and it's time to move on to the next one. Like usual, I'm using either 28 or 30 gauge wire for the buttons. And for this build, I'm using yellow and white wires to indicate the activation and auxiliary switches. Now that both buttons are completed, we just have to put them in their place in the holder. I ended up using some Loctite to secure these in place, which ended up taking way longer than I expected. But with them in place, you can see how the buttons from the hilts interact with them. I have to make sure that the plunger doesn't get caught on the button we just set up. The second to last step to completing this module is to put the holder that I designed on it so we can prepare for the rotary chassis PCB. So I actually made a mistake while setting up this rotary chassis PCB. The side that you're seeing me put the pins in right now is actually the back side, which means that I'm doing this completely backwards. And I didn't end up noticing the mistake until I had soldered in all the pins. So I had to spend ages undoing what I had just done in order for me to redo it on the correct side. For all of you out there looking to build your own lightsabers, please just make sure you know which side you're setting these pins up on. But now that I have everything set up like it should be, it's time to attach the wires. Now all we have to do is glue it together. We now have the entire module completed, with the buttons, NeoPixel connector, and rotary chassis PCB. We're going to want to make sure this all works before we glue it into the hilt, so for now, let's put it off to the side, and then we can get started on the speaker and battery section. It's now time to install the battery tabs. This part is pretty straightforward, but I'm going to go over it anyways for you guys. After putting them in the helping hands, I just pre-solder the tabs, and then solder the wires to them. After that's done, all that's left is to put them in the chassis. And here they are. I'm going to be gluing them in later once I know everything works. But for now, let's move on to installing the speaker. Once again, I'm going to be using this 28mm bass speaker. So here I'm using yellow wire for the speaker, which I normally don't do, but I'm running low on all my normal wires. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter what colors you use, as long as you know what they're doing. With the speaker and battery tabs all set up, it's time to move to the other side of the chassis with the rotary chassis PCB. This is a pretty straightforward setup. I'm just going to pre-tin all of the pads and then attach 2 negative wires, 1 positive wire, the negative and positives of the buttons, and the data line. Once we have all the wires attached, we can then put it inside the chassis. There are now only 2 parts left to go before we're completely done with the install. Now it's time to install the final 2 pieces, starting with the Bluetooth module. Like usual, I'm going to be using either 28 or 30 gauge wire. Now that all the wires are attached to the Bluetooth module, we just got to put it into the chassis and then we can move on to the final part, the soundboard. So for the next part, you're just going to be watching me solder a bunch of wires to the soundboard. So while this is pretty tedious and boring, keep in mind that I did actually skip quite a lot of prep work I had to do for the wires before getting to this point. In my chassis design, I made a shelf to put the soundboard into. I figured it would help prevent the soundboard from ever popping out. So far, it looks like it works pretty well. We now have all of the electronics installed in the lightsaber, but before I put everything together, I need to test to see if it works. First, I want to have a look at the NeoPixel and button module. Just by looking at the outside of it, everything seems to be glued down like it needs to be. None of the connectors are crooked, so that's not going to cause any issues, and the buttons aren't sticking out too far. So that's going to be all set for when we test it inside the hilt. But for now, let's make sure everything else works. So far, it seems like everything's working great. And now before I try everything in the hilt, I want to show you the last part that's essential for making this all work. This ring forces the chassis to make proper connection with the button module. It also helps to protect the speaker. It's finally time to see if everything I built for this lightsaber works. Since we already tested the main chassis, the real question is whether or not the button and NeoPixel module is going to work. So to start, I have to slide the buttons in through the top of the hilt so they fall into their designated holes. Then once I have them oriented correctly, I can slide the button module through the bottom of the hilt before it stops right where it needs to be because the buttons hit the 3D printed holder that I made. Now it's time to screw on the emitter. Next we have to put in the chassis. Looks like there's a bit too much friction, so I'm going to want to sand it later to make it slide better. But now goes in the booster ring that I made. That'll make sure everything in the lightsaber makes full connection and won't slide around. With that, it's time to see if it works. It looks like my button module solution is working exactly how I wanted it to. Now let's see if the blade will light up. Okay, I'm super happy with how this turned out. Now that we know it works, it's time to finalize everything. The first thing I did was glue the booster ring to the pommel. This way we don't have to keep track of it, and we're much less likely to lose it. The next thing I did was sand down the chassis so it can slide in and out of the hilt easier. My goal with this whole project was to make this lightsaber as easy to operate as possible. Which brings me to the last thing I did. As you can see, the button module isn't falling out. As you know, preventing the buttons from falling out was the biggest problem I had to solve with this lightsaber. And after I came up with the idea of making the button and NeoPixel module modular, I finally got around to gluing it in place. Now we never have to worry about the buttons ever falling out again. I can now finally say that this entire lightsaber project has been completed. And it came out super well if I do say so myself. Just look how easy it is to set it up. You just slide the chassis in, screw in the pommel, and you're done. And now that everything's been completed, I just want to say thank you to everyone who stuck around watching this from start to finish. So thank you, and please enjoy this Bluetooth demonstration.
Negotiations begin.
Thanks again to everyone who's watched up until this point, and I'll see you next time.